Okay, today is Wednesday, August 7th, 2019. This is the Cluster API Office Hours meeting, a subproject of SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Let me go ahead and share my screen so that we can get the, whoops, upside down. So we can get the meeting agenda up here. Let me get to the right account. And bear with me while it logs me back in. Okay. Now that I have the right one, let's see. As usual, please add yourself to the attending list if you have not done so already. And let's get through the agenda. Jason, you have the first item, please.
Yes, I just wanted to let everybody know that the version 0.1.9 release has been cut. Added support for customized versions 3.0.3 and later. Added some logic to improve the cluster deletion workflow, in particular if you're using kubectl to delete clusters. Now the cascading deletion isn't relying on the Kubernetes garbage collection. And there was a fix for how we set the owner references for machines, machine sets, and machine deployments. So if you are using it and you would like any of those fixes, go ahead and update your vendors and your deployments now.
Thank you, Jason. Does anybody have any questions for Jason about this release? All right, let's move on to Alpha 2 provider status. So I will talk about a few of these, but I'm soliciting help from others where I don't have statuses. The first one is the kubeadm bootstrap provider. Thanks to some hard work from Chuck and Fabrizio, we have the basic reconcile flow working. So we can generate some stub cloud init data, and hopefully soon we'll be able to actually generate control plane init, control plane join, and regular node join data as well. Before I move on, any questions on this provider's status? All right. Chuck, are you here and can you talk about CapD? If not, sorry, I'm just getting my participants list up so I can see. All right, well, in terms of CapD, I know that we have been working to finish out some of the missing pieces that we didn't initially get when we started the Alpha 2 work. So things like setting the cluster status ready field and so on. So maybe we can get Chuck to come back and fill this in with more of an update later. For the AWS provider, we released the 0.3.7. I meant to bring in some release notes for this, but got sidetracked. So I will come back and fill them in a minute, or you can go back or go look at the release to see what's there. And then in terms of Alpha 2 work, we are porting some bug fixes that we found and fixed in the release 3 branch, or release 0.3 branch, which is V1 Alpha 1, and we're getting those ported up to master so that they'll work for V1 Alpha 2. Chuck, I see you just showed up. Can you give a status update on CapD for Alpha 2, please?
Yes, I can. Right now, I have a local branch that's hacked together that's working with pretty much everything all together to make clusters, which is really cool. There are a couple of open PRs going to improve CapD. Not that interesting to go into detail, mostly just making cloud init work with the kindest nodes. But yeah, it's more or less all come together in the past couple of days.
Awesome, thank you, Chuck. Justin, are you here? I see you. Do you have a CapG status for us?
I am here, but I have no progress made on CapG, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you. Anybody for the OpenStack provider? Okay, no news. All right, CapV, Andrew or Andrew?
Yeah, so thanks, Andy. So we released V041 last week, or the team did. I was on PTO, and so that was really cool to see them come together and do that without my interference. It's probably actually easier me there. There was a bug fix included as well as 018 capi, so people should take a look at that. I've linked release notes. V1 Alpha 2 work started about 2 weeks ago due to time box to issue. We've just been collecting so far the changes we need to make to support V1 Alpha 2. And there has been a discussion lately. I'm going to file a few issues today that will probably, it's going to end up being related to the bootstrapper. I'm not sure how many of the other providers are dealing with multi-NIC, multi-device, multi-IP address setups. But we've been dealing it a bunch with CapV due to some use cases. And one concern we have is how we're going to end up handling that when we relinquish some of that control to the bootstrapper for the Ginger templates and all that good stuff. So I'm going to be touching base with, I guess, Chuck and Fabrizio on that, as well as filing some issues to sort of outline the some of the problems we're seeing when we're expecting that instance data to be heterogeneous or homogeneous across all the providers. I want to make sure we're during that V1 Alpha 2 work, we're doing testing with the multi-NIC environments.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. Anybody around to speak for CapZ? I don't see Stephen. Okay. News, bare metal provider. Michael, can you speak to that?
Yes, yeah, I put the link there to the issue that we've at least created to track it, and that's really the only progress we have so far on doing any work towards it.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks for getting that filed. And then in terms of the upgrade tool, we had been waiting on the Bootstrap provider to solidify a bit more, but I think we're probably at a close enough point that we can go ahead and open up an issue and see if we can get anybody who's interested to start working on updating the upgrade tool to work with Alpha 2. And there's a question here. Was this from you, Tim?
It was. And Andrew's on the call, so I want to, poke him here. Should people who are doing providers now, should we try to default latest versions of providers to start to use out-of-tree cloud providers?
So I think for the out-of-tree providers, it's going to be on a per provider basis. So I know for OpenStack and vSphere, they have relatively mature out-of-tree providers, so they will be they should be using the out-of-tree providers for V1 Alpha 2, probably also Azure as well. But I know for folks at Google and AWS, they're still developing the out-of-tree providers at an earlier stage, so I wouldn't expect them to be adopting that for V1 Alpha
2. The ability to upgrade is going to be awkward for those people that it might be a requirement that we might want to place on things for graduation to beta, right? Just so that we don't get this weird upgrade scenario going forwards in the future.
Yeah, I agree. It would be super ideal if before beta we can get everyone on the out-of-tree providers. But yeah, that's going to require coordination with the folks working on the providers and having them put more resources into their CCMs.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. The last time I inquired in what was previously SIG AWS about the status of the AWS provider, it was highly recommended not to rely on that because it wasn't as fully functional as the in-tree provider was. And that's the main reason why we've avoided it to date with the AWS provider. But I do like the idea of blocking beta on having all of the cloud providers or all of the SIG-owned, SIG project-managed cloud providers or provider implementations using the external provider.
Any other comments on this topic? Tim, did you get what you wanted in terms of the discussion on this one?
I did. That's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All
But
right.
I'll also raise this one in the SIG call today. This would be a good kind of incentive to push on this effort more. That's all. Thanks, Tim.
Okay. Next up is the UX of V1 Alpha 2. So I opened up an issue and we had some back and forth. What I was suggesting or pointing out is that with V1 Alpha 1, because we have the provider specific details embedded in cluster and machine, and there's no delineation between bootstrapping and infrastructure, you literally can create a cluster object and a machine object and you're done if you just want to have a one node cluster. And in V1 Alpha 2, because we have removed the embedded provider specs and made them standalone CRDs, you now have to create a cluster, an infrastructure specific cluster. So using Kappa as an example, you would need an AWS cluster resource, a machine, an AWS machine, and a kubeadm config. And so now you have 5 resources instead of 2. And so I was suggesting or asking for comments that maybe we would find some way to annotate or indicate on the cluster that you wanted to have some defaults for what your bootstrapper would be, what your infrastructure provider would be, and that potentially could key the infrastructure controller, the bootstrap controller to do some automation around creating some of these extra resources for you if you don't want to stray from any of the defaults. And so there was a lot of back and forth, and Tim suggested that we discuss it at today's meeting. So Jason, you've got your hand up.
Yep, and I raised this in the issue, but one of the concerns that I potentially have is embedding actually part of the API into the annotations instead of just using the annotations to kind of track internal state. I worry that we could potentially be creating kind of a shadow API. And I brought up the idea of anything that could be a top level field like the default provider to use if one's not specified. We could potentially just make those top level fields directly, and then it's baked into the API itself instead of having to deal with potential issues of providing API guarantee consistencies around these annotations as well. That doesn't necessarily solve the issue for defaults within for one of those specified providers for the configuration though. And I think Vince had some suggestions there, but he's not here today.
I like the idea. I am in no way wedded to using annotations. It was just the first thought that came to mind that didn't require changing the spec, but if we want to look at doing this for Alpha 3 potentially, then yeah, I think it makes sense to modify the spec.
I'd like to do it for Alpha 2 just from a user experience standpoint. And if we need to have annotations as a way station for the time being, I think that's okay. I think one of the things that this particular subproject, I think, struggles from is user experience. And I think modifying that to make it simpler for people who are developing their specs or have an auto generation tool to do that, it will just make it that much simpler, right?
I think Chuck, then Moshe, then Michael.
Cool. Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm a huge +1 in making this simplified user experience. Annotations or spec, both are fine. I think reducing the number of objects needed to create a cluster is the kernel of goodness in here that I like a lot.
Okay, Moshe. Can't hear you if you're talking. Why don't we come back to you, Michael?
Yeah, I would say this is one of my primary concerns that changed from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Alpha 2 is it's created a proliferation of controllers and things and more moving parts, and I'm not really crazy about it.
Okay, Moshe, see if your mic's working.
Marco?
There we go. Now I can hear you.
Cool. Yeah, so I agree with improving the user experience. So my qualm or query is really about where the defaulting is done. And I think applying defaults on the cluster object itself might defeat the purpose of the cluster object of the default. So thinking as an end user who wants to go and create a cluster and use the default, and perhaps those defaults are provided by my platform team, specifying those defaults on the cluster is at odds with that. So to me, the defaults really should be applied on something other than what you are defaulting. So perhaps as an argument or on the actual cluster API provider or on an operator that is managing the cluster API provider, so that we don't kind of taint that model.
I'm not sure I quite followed the like exactly where there's a problem. So could you
if
give a more specific example?
So, for example, if you in an enterprise with a platform team that manages the platform being Kubernetes and the clusters of Kubernetes, and you have feature development teams that want to consume that platform and create clusters. So if I'm a consumer of this being the cluster API, then I want to use the defaults that have been provided by the platform team managing the platform. So I wouldn't know to use a default AWS and a default kubeADM. I just want to declare my intent to have a cluster of X number of nodes. The default behavior is something that I want specified once for that entire environment. So the defaults are something to me that should be on the provider, not on the cluster or the instance of a cluster.
I understand what he's saying. I mean, that makes sense to me. Where, yeah, the motion that makes sense. It'd be like this is very broad, but like having an environment variable or something. So if there isn't a default defined on the cluster, it's assumed to be a thing, and that assumption could be configured outside that cluster spec.
Correct.
So Tim, then Daniel, then I have a response as well.
I think you can do this outside the scope of the change modification that Andy has proposed. Andy and Jason have proposed. I think that you could set policy external to this that autofills the fields based upon the settings, like auto generation stuff. Can do this for you. You could do this with the cluster ADM proposal. Could have a default setting that could be configured.
So that was actually my initial. I'll go after everyone else. Sorry.
Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, what I understand most of you describing is something like a cluster is analogous to a pod, and that pod needs to have some some dynamic storage, so provision volume claim, and how do you create that provision volume claim? You have a storage class, unless you so that there might be a default storage class. So in the same way, there might be something like a cluster class or provider class, right? That is outside of the cluster object that is the one that's chosen by default by the provider to to fulfill the desired cluster state. Is that kind of Moshe? Is that similar to what you were thinking?
Yeah, either or in cluster ADM or cluster ADM operator. So I think all of those kind of meet that objective.
So I think there's two user stories here. There's one which is I'm a user. I don't necessarily belong to a platform team, and I just want a more simplified user experience. And I think that's what Jason and I have put together that can address that. There's also the other user story, which is I'm a user. I want a Kubernetes cluster. I don't need to worry about the defaults for the provider and the region and whatnot, because that's what a platform team does for me. And so there's two different levels of defaulting that I think are potentially relevant here.
Yeah, I also think like you can invoke separation of concerns. I think you can get policy enforcement through several mechanisms. Like you could have an admission control webhook, to do forced policy and stuff like that. So I think we can address your concern, Moshe, in a number of different ways that I think would still allow the generic UX to move forwards and policy enforcement to be a separate thing.
Okay.
Jason, you had your hand up. I know you put it down. Did you have something else that you wanted to add?
So I was just going to say, I think there's actually 3 levels of defaults. One for the providers themselves, one for, say, like a deployment-wide management, whoever's managing the management cluster, like a platform team. And then, this level that we've been talking about for, how do I stamp out additional things created for a specific cluster? But yeah.
Moshe, I don't know if we have an issue around a platform-wide set of defaults. If we don't, would you be interested in creating one?
Yeah, although I think we can perhaps combine it on that one issue and solve for all 3 use cases.
We could, although I think the implementations will differ, wouldn't they?
They might, but at least the intent would be we would align the implementations. So even if it gets broken up, it's easier to break something up than converge 3 things.
Okay. Why don't you add a comment then about the platform-wide defaulting, if you would?
Cool.
Thank you. Any other comments on this topic before we move on to the next one? Daniel, sorry, I see your hands up.
I just wondering what's the alternative to this? So granted, we want to improve user experience. There are more objects, more sort of fields to provide to default. Is doing this in a CLI or in a shell script an alternative? And if it is, why is that a worse place to start than just going straight to annotations or fields and doing these kind of server-side defaults?
I think that's a good question worth recording as a comment on the issue, if you wouldn't mind. I also would say that anything you do client-side has to be, like, it's implemented in a client, but if you don't want to use that client, then just like if you aren't using kube control to do everything, you may end up losing out on some functionality if it's only written in kube control. So doing it as an annotation or a spec field, I think helps guarantee that it works everywhere. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, I'll add that to the issue. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, I mean, my vision, like, for this would be from a user standpoint is I would like to create like a CRD, and I just request a cluster in GCP, and then that thing stamps out all the things that I need to happen, and the administrator on that master cluster has already set up all defaults or whatever configured tunable, so like the cluster object and all the other objects aren't necessarily have to be like end user consumable. There could be another thing above it.
I would recommend you take a look at the cluster ADM proposal because it covers some of that. This is a lower level issue, and they're both valuable, but I think yours applies more to cluster ADM. Okay.
Do you have a link to that cluster ADM proposal?
Yeah, we'll make sure.
I'll relink it in the doc. It's down below, but I'll relink it.
Thanks, Tim. All right, Tim, you have the next one, picking a version schema.
All right, let's get on the boxing gloves and talk about version schema. So the currently, if you look across providers and look across capi, it's unintelligible to the average consumer what version of capi applies to this provider, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that issue, there's a couple of different proposed ideas. I don't really have strong opinions of A versus B, other than I really have strong opinions that we need to pick something. And I also have strong opinions in that that we should follow upstream where possible, and we don't need to be pedantic about certain things with Semver, right? Because almost every implementation I've ever seen never truly follows Semver to the T, right? So with those two in mind, maybe we could have a little bit of a discussion. Or not.
I don't see any hands raised, so that's why I'm staying.
I think I want to have this enforced for V1 Alpha 2 because any person who's trying to look at this and look across providers, it's unintelligible. You can't make any sense out of it at all, right? You can't look at any provider and say and root back just easily to where it came from. You'd have to go through the SHAs and then figure out from the vendors what it actually means and where it came from. And the average consumer should not have to do something like that. That's too much.
Michael.
Well, this reminds me of the point I've been trying to make. If the future is having all these different providers all deployed into the same namespace on one deployment of cluster API, then we need something more than just a written mechanism to ensure version compliance. We need something more dynamic.
I think that's fair. I think, but we can, start with baby steps. Like, one, have some policy written down. And then two, the second part's enforcement. Looks like Jason has some raised.
Yeah, so it kind of follows on to Michael's comment. I think, to me, the problem is less around the actual versions of the components and more around knowing kind of how things work. And I think with the simplified management experience that we've been talking about with the cluster ADM operator, it would be more about publishing and managing metadata between the components to have a machine readable way to determine compatibility between the components rather than trying to strictly tie in, actual release binary versions and trying to get those to align. Because the thing that I fear there is that we're going to have issues where something could be a breaking change on a provider side that isn't tied to a breaking change on the cluster API core side, and trying to manage those with aligned versions and get across to users that some actions needs to be taken. I worry we'll get lost in, just publishing patch updates.
I hear what you're saying, but at the same time, like, it's unintelligible today, right? Like, what we have today is super bad, right? Like, it is unintelligible to any average user, especially if they have a management cluster, right? So if they want to do a bug report, right, for a specific version dating back, there's no means by which we can report information to be able to truly diagnose the state space of what the issue was and where it came from. You have to have a developer. Michael.
Yeah, I think I guess what I'm getting at, and it sounds like what Jason's getting at, is we need to have that end goal in mind for whatever we come up with here, whatever this versioning looks like and wherever it lives, that it needs to be plugged right into whatever that discovery mechanism is. I guess just to inform the process, not really start there. That's what I'm saying.
Well, maybe we can, it doesn't seem like we have consensus. So maybe I can draft up a doc with more details for us to talk about and reconvene during the next meeting.
Okay. Or, I don't know, add to the GitHub issue if you want. Okay. Action item following up. What is the TLDR on cluster cuddle? So just to refresh everybody's memory, we have two competing GitHub issues around cluster cuddle and alpha 2. One is to get rid of it, and the other is to bring forward support so that cluster cuddle in v1 alpha 2 will handle pivoting correctly along with all the other functionality. So Jason and I and Andrew and Jenny met on Friday last week to discuss what does it mean to pivot in Alpha 1 and what sort of gaps exist going forward into Alpha 2. And we have a Google Doc. I'll paste the link in here in a bit. And we just brainstormed a lot and think we have a solution that may end up simplifying pivoting and making it fairly easy, hopefully, to implement for Alpha 2. And Andrew and the folks at New Relic have volunteered to do a bit of a spike to see how easy that might be and also write up a design plan for it. So Andrew, if you're around, do you have any further updates?
Yeah, so the only additional info is that, since that meeting, we've been focused on jumping in and getting the Bootstrap provider into a place where it's all testable and working as kind of one big unit with the Docker provider and Capi itself. So we haven't started any actual work testing the pivot because we'd like all of those things to work so that we can just have a more, I guess, comprehensive look at how pivoting will work with both providers functioning.
Tim, does that answer your question for at least a bit of an update?
It does. I just want to make sure that people are aware of dates. We're proposing a cut of V1 Alpha 2 at the end of August. So I think we have to make a decision of what road we want to take pretty soon.
Yeah, and there's other things that are in the ecosystem, like writing conversion tools to be able to take Kappa V1 Alpha 1 clustering machines and convert them to V1 Alpha 2, and then similar tools for the other providers. There's also the upgrade tool for managing cluster upgrades that would need to get upgraded to Alpha 2. I think there's enough work left that not all of the tooling in the ecosystem is going to be done by the end of August in terms of getting it updated for Alpha 2. So we may need to decide either to stick to the date but have some tooling come afterwards, or slip the date, just depending on what's missing and how important it is. Any other comments on this one? Okay. Tim, cluster cap ADM.
I had proposed a couple of times as PSAs in the last couple of meetings. There's plenty of comments there. I was just wondering if anyone had any conversation pieces, good, bad, and different, to discuss with the broader group with regards to the proposal that's written up there. I know Daniel and Moshe all had comments, and Jason did too as well.
Yeah, I think most of my comments were more around, you know, what does the potential implementation look like, especially around the provider plugins and things like that. So I'm interested to see what that looks like when it starts shaping up. But you know, from the high level view that's presented, I think things definitely look pretty good and are definitely an improvement over what we have today.
Ace.
I was actually a little bit curious, Tim, about what your vision for the Bootstrap portion of Cluster ADM would look like. I mean, it sounded like you were kind of previously leaning towards using Kind as a cluster, or people would need to bring their own Bootstrap cluster. But I saw that you did have a Bootstrap user story in Cluster ADM. Could you just speak a little bit to that?
The Bootstrap user story is if you want to actually get a provider-specific management cluster. So yeah, so this basically says starting from zero, which could be Kind, how do I get a initial management cluster up and running?
So it'd be, yeah, you already have your own Kind cluster. I see. Okay.
Yeah, and it says inside the doc there's a precondition that before all the requirements.
Yeah, that was exactly why I was confused. I didn't understand the Bootstrap cluster would be a Bootstrap cluster in AWS. I thought it was for the AWS provider or something like that.
Yeah, yeah.
So Tim, what is your thinking around the timeline for comments on the proposal and then moving to, I assume, a capi PR?
I would like to just move forwards. Like if people have comments, please add them. You know, I've given like 3 weeks. I can do a capi PR probably like now. Most of this I would expect to refine over time too as well. This is kind of like the proposal for a tool to solve the cross-provider problem as well as the cluster cuddle problem. Because as in the beginning of this cycle, we wanted to evaluate whether or not cluster cuddle, it would be the right type of solution in the fullness of time. And I didn't want to overload or rebrand cluster cuddle for the time being. I think having a clear cut or distinction in the name kind of helps to make it a little bit easier for people to recognize and then deprecate the other over time. So my plan tentatively is to probably push up a cap. I don't know, I could easily do it this week and try to address comments. We already have a repo started and have the stubs of what we ideally would like to make in place, or at least the beginnings of it, and then maybe move for merge by the end of the cycle or something. We're trying to look for people who also want to work on it too, or are interested in this area.
Okay. Ace, your hand is still up. I'm not sure if that was from before or a new comment.
Sorry, that was still from before.
No worries. Thanks. All right. I would say I'll just echo what Tim said. Please get your comments in, and we'll proceed from there. Sound good, Tim?
Sounds good.
Okay, Justin, it's time for your public shaming again. So just doing a status check on the drain and cordon pull request.
Thank you. I appreciate it, and I will try to do it today. I find that if I don't get things done in the same day, it just doesn't happen. So
if there's anything that anybody can do to help you out, please let us know.
Well, I think it's mostly I just need to address the PR, the review changes.
Okay.
On my other shaming, I think we have Kappa accounts set up. Can anyone confirm that that's working?
Yes, I can confirm that it all appears to be working great. I've been working on updating our end-to-end tests, and as far as I can tell, we haven't had any conflicts related to running within the same account that we were previously seeing. and I haven't heard any complaints from cops since we've re-enabled the janitor work as well. So I think we are now in the clear. Thank you very much, Justin.
Yay, thank you for setting that up.
All right, thanks, Justin. Okay, I don't see any other agenda items. So if you think of something, let me know. Or Jason, were you adding something or just doing the
I'm
Kappa?
just adding notes about the AWS accounts.
Okay, let's go over to new issues. So we have a whole bunch that are milestoned. It looks like there's the one that we previously were talking about for the user experience. And let's go ahead and so Tim, I know you were saying you were hoping to do some of this stuff for Alpha 2. There's also still all the remaining work for Alpha 2, at least if we're trying to get to the end of the month deadline. So what are you thinking here?
I think it's up to the community. Like, is the user experience or the end user experience important enough to sort of slip the clutch and try to get this into V1 Alpha 2, or are people more pressed to want to get a new cut and rebase their changes? So I think I'll defer to everyone else here. I have opinions, but I don't want to sway other people's decisions.
Michael.
I'm thinking the faster we ship V1 Alpha 2, the faster other people can start integrating with it, whatever those integrations may be. And if this is just feature work we're talking about doing on top of V1 Alpha 2, I don't think there's a reason to delay shipping it.
I think that's reasonable. Jason?
So this is where I worry about creating a shadow API. I think if we wait to ship it after V1 Alpha 2 and we end up going annotation based, we're essentially just extending the API via the annotations, and we're basically just giving ourselves an end round around, not modifying the actual API schema. I prefer we just go ahead and bite the bullet, take on the schema changes, and just ship it as part of V1 Alpha 2.
So it sounds like if we don't want to do annotations, if we want to avoid them, then the options are increase the scope of V1 Alpha 2 to do this, or delay it until V1 Alpha 3, right?
I don't think it's that simple, though. I mean, essentially, even if we go the annotation route, we're still creating a dependency on the providers to be able to support those annotations.
Well, I'm saying if we don't do the annotations, then you either make a spec change in V1 Alpha 2 and the scope of V1 Alpha 2 increases, or we wait until V1 Alpha 3, also with the spec change.
Yep, indeed. Because otherwise what we're doing is we're basically creating some type of midpoint release that has a requirement on providers to support the annotations, and that's not much different than an API version level change at that point.
Right. Michael? Thought you had your hand up. Maybe not.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I just hit the wrong button. Well, I feel like we spent a lot of time, a lot of very many people ironing out the API changes for V1 Alpha 2. And so I don't think we'll be able to dedicate the same amount of time and effort before the end of the cycle to do that. And I'm not still 100% clear on exactly what this should look like. This is the first time I've seen this issue. So I think still needs time.
Yeah, I'm inclined to just put this at next and priority importance soon. So unless you object, that's what I'm going to do.
So one option, and this was added recently, like as in during this meeting as a comment on the issue, but Daniel raised the potential to potentially offer some type of client-side tooling that would precede the availability of cluster ADM that could potentially fill this gap as well.
That's true. Okay. Let's move on to the other issue. This one I'm familiar with. It is and it has an open PR. So it's going to come in the milestone. It's just a bug fix for a logic issue in some of our code. So not really worth discussing. All right. Do we want to go over the kubeadm Bootstrap providers issues, or is that not something that people want to see? Any thoughts? Michael?
I don't know anything about it, so I'm interested to hear about it.
Okay, let's pull them over. So I'm only going to look at the ones that don't have milestones. This first one is set up image release pipeline. So
next.
Next, okay.
This is something that would be nice to have, but it's manual. It can be done manually, and it's not necessary.
Okay, that's fair. Support for external etcd. I opened this one. I just was copying something from, I think Kappa maybe. And Jason, you had a comment which I remembered but have not read since you pasted it there.
Yeah, I was just saying that adding support for this might be easier once we have control plane management primitives. Otherwise, it's going to potentially create some complications for, how do users manually consume this.
Right. Michael?
For me, this goes back to being somewhat opinionated in a particular Bootstrap provider. I don't really see a good reason to support this.
So this is definitely something that, at least on the VMware side, we've had a request to be able to do this. So whether the, I don't think that the kubeadm bootstrapper would be operating the external etcd. It just we need to make sure that it's possible to point at it, which it should be today with the kubeadm config. So I think this probably belongs maybe in the cluster API repository or some other one that's around the broader discussion of I'm managing clusters and I want to be able to have something that can manage an external etcd for me, which may be etcd ADM. And then we have some documentation on how to integrate easily when using this provider. In any case, I don't think this is anything that needs to happen for V1 Alpha 2 or 0.1. So I'm just going to do next and probably long-term important. All right, error logging strategy, Chuck. This has to do with the wrapped and stack traces, right?
Yeah, this is how to make this debuggable, pretty much. I just haven't used it enough to know what a good, should we wrap things? It seems like when I'm using clogr, or when I'm using zap, it kind of produces useless stack traces. I don't know what clogr does. So if anybody is using this Bootstrap provider and has thoughts on how they would like to see errors and stack traces handled, please file comments on this issue.
All right, I'm going to put it in next, mainly because we're functional without fixing this.
Can I throw Lubomir under the bus?
You want to assign him?
No, we were talking about this similar types of problems today,
Gotcha.
So we have to solve it in kubeadm proper.
Yeah, because Chuck created this ticket a long time ago in kubeadm, and we're still figuring out how to solve this. So I have no idea how to solve it in the Bootstrap provider,
Alrighty. Oh, this one has a milestone. I did not mean to click on that. overlap between cluster network and kubeadm bootstrap provider configuration.
Yes, this was from a comment on a PR. I believe Fabrizio had some concerns about cluster network and the configuration that is able to be supplied through kubeadm, and we need to figure out how to resolve that. I haven't looked into it much farther than that.
Okay, I think we should try and resolve this prior to the release.
I agree.
Okay. Next up, ensure Docker build is not broken with a verify script. There was a PR for this, right?
Yeah, there's also a testing for PR that is pending, I believe.
Okay. And this one is mine, which is we have an additional user data files field in the top level config spec, but it is not wired up to anything. So this is just something that needs to be done. So I think I need to get the priority on here. And there is code in the AWS provider that has this if anyone is interested in working on it. We could look at that as an example, and I'll paste a link in here. And that is, I believe, the end of, the issues here. So does anybody have anything else that you want to discuss today? If not, we will end a few minutes early. Michael.
Yeah, just any updates on exact dates or locations for the in-person gathering?
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. So we are still trying to find a location. We've been working to try and get something in San Francisco, but are having trouble. So we may be able to get something in Mountain View. AT&T has offered up their facility in San Ramon, which is about 45 minutes to an hour, I think, east of San Francisco. So we are working as quickly as we can to resolve it. And I know everybody would need to book travel ASAP. So I will try and get an update to the mailing list later this week with some news, hopefully.
How about Palo Alto?
What was that, Ivan?
How about meeting at VMware campus in Palo Alto?
I don't think that's an option right now.
Yeah, there were concerns about having a large enough public space at the VMware campus in Palo Alto, and that's why San Francisco was initially brought up.
Yeah, I apologize that it's taking a while to get the logistics nailed down, but we are working on it.
Is there an estimate of how many attendees? I could try to shake some trees, see if we have any facilities.
I think we're, hold on, let me look. We were definitely in the upper 20s of people who'd responded to the survey. Let me just double check. Oh, actually, no, we now have 38 responses. So somewhere between 20 and 40. It's hard to say, will everybody actually attend? Seth?
I'm happy to check on our side if we can host it at the New Relic office in Portland, if that's a city that would be amenable to anyone.
I would say it's worth asking, if we can get some space.
I can also ask about Google offices. I know there is one in San Francisco, but I don't know how much space there is, but it would likely be Mountain View or Sunnyvale. So not San Francisco, but I can ask.
Okay. I appreciate the offers. Yeah, if you all want to poke a little bit and see what you can come up with, we're going to keep on it on our end as well.
And you said 38, right?
I have 38 responses to the survey. Yeah.
Thank you.
And what is the date?
We are right now trying to do the week of September 16th. preferably Tuesday to Wednesday, which would be the 17th and 18th, or Wednesday to Thursday, which would be the 18th and 19th. If that week doesn't work, a large number of people are also available the following week, which would either be the 24th and 25th or 25th and 26th.
Has anybody checked in with whoever runs like the local Kubernetes meetup? Like they might be plugged into somebody that's got a facility there.
That's a good idea. I don't know. But we do have people on our end who are trying to get space, so I can bring these suggestions to them as well. All right. Any last items? All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending and participating. As always, it's been a great conversation, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.